This week, you're going to learn about global economic issues relating to the environment. This is a topic that I have a great interest in, and it's something that I've just studied extensively in graduate school, but even personally. My wife and I, for example, last summer, we went to Arches National Park out in Utah. And as you can see, it's a pretty dramatic place. I find it very peaceful, very relaxing. We enjoyed our time in the environment. And we like to do things in the environment, but we also recognize that sometimes the environment is affected by our actions. So this week, we're going to examine how our actions and the environment play with each other and interact with each other around the world, and how they impact the economic growth and development of countries, whether they're lesser developed or whether they're advanced countries. So one of the leading principles behind any study of the environment is the idea of an externality. An externality is the principle that really makes the environment a challenging issue. So an externality, by definition, simply is a cost or a benefit that's borne by a third party to a transaction. So it's somebody outside the primary parties of a transaction. This third party is experiencing either a cost or a benefit. So for example, if you happen to live near a railroad track, you might experience the noise of the passing trains, even though you have nothing to do with the railroad industry. Maybe you've never even ridden on a train. But the train passes by your house and causes noise that you then have to experience. And it's not like the railroad company is going to come to your house every day and say, "I'm sorry," or give you a check for $5 every time your walls shake. The key is with an externality, the railroad company has the right to do what they're doing. It's just their action. It works against other people, and if it's a cost, it's a negative externality, and it means that third party had nothing to do with the transaction, and they're not going to experience any kind of compensation for the negative thing that they've had to experience. If a third party experiences a benefit, that third party doesn't have to pay for that benefit. They just happen to get the benefit of that. So for example, if my neighbor were to just do extensive landscaping and make it really beautiful to look at their lawn, I can look out my window and look at their beautiful landscaping and get a benefit from that. But I didn't have to pay any of the cost for my neighbor's landscaping. So the externality essentially means that there's something that either negatively or positively is being imposed on people outside of these direct transactions. So I'd challenge you, pause the video and think about, do you currently experience any negative or positive externalities? So for example, some people may say, I experience a negative externality when I go to a restaurant and I have to, there's the family next to me with the screaming child. They have a right to be there with their child unless the restaurant prohibits that, and I don't know of any restaurants that do. They have the right to be there, but the screaming child might be impacting the enjoyment that you're experiencing with your meal. So that would be a negative externality. On the other hand, maybe a positive externality that you might experience might have to do with For example, somebody else goes around and picks up the litter on the street outside your door. All of a sudden, your street is now clean, and you didn't have to pay for that, but you now have a clean street. So there's lots of different kinds of issues dealing with the environment and how they impact countries around the world. And I want to give just a little bit of background and try to tie in some of the geographic locations in which these issues are really being felt. So for example, air pollution. You have the factory that's putting pollution in the air. That has an impact on our health. And air pollution within the cities causes over 1 million deaths worldwide every year. Typically, it's most impactful in the middle income, the emerging countries. These are the countries that experience the largest share of the deaths related to urban air pollution. So think about the emerging markets. These are markets like Brazil, Russia, India, China, even Nigeria, Mexico. These are places that have advanced enough that they tend to be pretty predominant with manufacturing. Their GDP has a very large manufacturing sector. The lesser developed countries tends not to be where the manufacturing takes place. And the advanced countries, while they do have manufacturing, they also tend to have laws to protect the environment and to reduce the air pollution. So it's the middle income countries, the emerging markets, that tend to be impacted the most. So this is a map that shows particulate matter around the world in the air. And the greens and the yellows in the United States and Europe indicate that there's really not as bad of a particulate matter in the air as there is, for example, say in China, over here, in the East, and India. Those are places that experience a great deal of air pollution. In fact, when Beijing held the Summer Olympics, they actually had to close down the factories for a couple of weeks before the start of the Olympics in order for the air to clear, so that when everybody looked at the Olympics on the TV, they didn't see all this smog in the air, that it was clear air. So if we look at where people are dying relating to outdoor air pollution, again, you'll notice countries such as Russia, China, some of these South American countries tend to have darker shades of purple, which means they have a higher rate of death related to outdoor air pollution. Now, this is a map that shows deaths related to indoor air pollution. And so you'll notice Africa as a continent stands out with many countries that have a high rate of death related to indoor air pollution. Part of that has to do with the reality that for many of these people living in those countries, they are using wood to produce heat, to cook with, and they're doing it inside their homes, often with a lack of adequate ventilation. And so the smoke in their homes is causing a great deal of indoor air pollution, which impacts their health. Another concern that we have with the environment has to do with water. So if you look at this map, the areas with oranges and yellows tend to have water courses, rivers and streams that are more heavily damaged. So for example, if you look in the United States, you will see an orange line right down the middle of the United States. Do you know what river that is? That's the Mississippi River, and it's very polluted. You'll notice that much of the eastern United States has very heavily polluted waterways. Much of Europe has very heavily polluted waterways, whereas much of northern Canada and northern Russia tend to have pretty pure water. I don't know if you know your geography and your climate to know why that's the case, but most of that water is frozen, and so it tends to be rather pure. In South America, there's a large area of fairly pure water, and that's the Amazon rainforest. And then you'll notice in Northern Africa, there's really not much water at all through the Middle East and Northern Africa. However, in Central and Sub-Saharan Africa, there is some water, and it is fairly pure. There's some spots that are yellow, but there is a lot of fairly pure water in the continent of Africa. So another form of land pollution is land pollution. Some of that is pollution that we can't necessarily see. So for example, farmers use fertilizers and pesticides, and those are chemicals that might leach into the ground and then leach into the waterway. Manufacturers might be releasing heavy metals into the ground. And there's also just plain old general waste. Whether it's collected in a landfill or whether it's just thrown on the side of the road, general waste also has an impact on our environment. It's interesting to note that many of the lesser developed countries actually have a fairly substantial amount of general waste that sometimes it's just thrown out into the open. It might even be collecting in the streets. It might just be out in the fields. Can you think of why the lesser developed countries might tend to have more of that general waste just out in the open? They tend not to have municipal trash collection. So for example, in your advanced countries, they will have garbage companies that come to your house and pick up your waste, and then they'll collect it and either incinerate it or put it in a landfill somewhere. But your lesser developed countries tend not to have that type of trash collection. Now, unfortunately, some of that general waste ends up blowing around, and many times it ends up blowing into the waterways, and then it might end up in one of the oceans. Now, because of the natural currents in the Pacific Ocean, there is a tendency that plastic general waste gets collected in what's called the Great Pacific Vortex, and essentially the current of the Pacific Ocean swirls around this ocean, and it collects the trash, whatever happens to end up in the water. It collects it, and then it just circles it around and it churns it around. So they're discovering actually that while it may be one year a plastic bottle floating in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, a couple years later, it's been churned around so much that it's disintegrated into little tiny parts. And actually, that's the part that's having the impact on the marine environment, because the fish are digesting some of those very small plastic particles. And so that has an impact on the marine environment. Can you think of how these can be forms of pollution and externalities? Noise pollution. So if you live next to a factory, you might be experiencing the sirens that go off in the middle of the night. You have nothing to do with that factory, you just happen to live in the neighborhood. Or if you live next to an airport, guaranteed you'll be hearing the airplanes. That's noise pollution. Light also is a form of pollution. This is a visual of what the world looks like at night. And you can see the very developed countries such as Japan and the United States and Europe stand out very brightly. At nighttime, they're lit up. The lesser developed countries of the world, say, for example, in the middle of South America, as well as much of Africa, tend not to have light pollution. They tend not to have lights at night. Another form of an environmental impact is simply the loss of soil. Maybe countries are harvesting the trees for lumber or charcoal, or maybe they're just clearing the land to raise cattle. That causes erosion then. So for example, in Brazil, they are clearing the rainforests in order to raise cattle. In Brazil, however, there's often a lot of rain. And so when you have these hillsides that no longer have trees, but they have cattle, there tends to be a loss of soil. You tend to also be losing all the vegetation and the habitat for animals when you clear your forest. Now understand, I'm not saying that we should stop clearing our forests. The reality is we do need those trees sometimes, and sometimes we need that space for something else. Forests are a renewable resource. We can plant more trees. We just have to be conscious about what it is that we're actually doing. So this is a map that shows the change in forest area around the world. So you'll notice in South America and in parts of Africa, there's many shades of oranges and reds. That means that there's a loss of forest cover. However, in many of the advanced countries in Europe and the United States, and actually even in China, forests are being planted and we're actually gaining forest coverage. So there's a great debate about climate change. A lot of people say it's a hoax. A lot of people say, look at the data. But the reality is the climate is changing, and there are things that are having an impact upon countries of the world. So for example, there are countries right now in the South Pacific Ocean that are disappearing. Because the ocean level is rising, these small island countries are losing land. And they predict that some of these islands will disappear in a fairly short time. They are predicting, if you look at this map, that by the year 2100 or even 2050 in the South Pacific, the island country of Tuvalu will be gone. That's a country with a lot of people. It's a very beautiful island and has a lot of tourism. Those are people that will need to move somewhere else. That's 30 years away. There are other islands in Micronesia that are already gone. But then if you even look at other countries, Venice is going to possibly be completely submerged by the year 2100. You may say, well, that's a long ways away. And there's different perspectives on how far away that is. If you live in the city of Venice in Italy, you are becoming more and more accustomed to flooding. Now, if you know your geography, Venice is a city that actually its roadways are waterways. And this is where the gondolas are, and And there are roads, but most of the transportation actually, does happen on the water. But the ocean is rising, and every year they're experiencing more and more flooding in the city of Venice. So it's really not hard to imagine that by the year 2100, that's a place that will be completely gone, simply because the ocean levels are rising. We are also having an impact on the number and variety of animals and plants that exist around the world. You will notice the areas in red are the areas that are losing the most number of species. So you will notice the United States, Mexico, China, India, Brazil in South America. They're losing a large number of both plants and animal species, simply because of the actions and what we do. So how do we protect the environment? The reality is we need the environment. That's how we live as human beings. We survive. We need air. We need water. We also need space to live. So how do we live our lives while also protecting the environment? One approach is to create some laws. So for example, one of the probably the most impactful and widest ranging law that was created recently was the Kyoto Protocol. So in the Kyoto Protocol, 191 nations actually signed on to this treaty, indicating that they would agree to do some things to protect the environment. The United States did not ratify this treaty, and Canada had ratified it, but they have left the treaty in 2012. Now, I also want to point out when this occurred. This was in the year 2005 that the countries of the world got together and said, we need to do something. One of the things that the Kyoto Protocol does is it had each country agree to reducing different forms of pollution by different percentages. And the challenge of this law that many of the advanced countries of the world saw was that we can agree to reduce our level of air pollution by 20%, but you have to recognize that we've already taken care of the easy types of air pollution. We already have filters on our smokestacks. We already have ways of collecting larger particles of air pollution. We're already doing the easy stuff, so it becomes more expensive to keep reducing it at those same levels. Whereas countries that are less developed, or even emerging countries, they might not have any reduction in air pollution. And so to get a reduction of 20% might not really be all that costly for them to undertake. So the way I like to illustrate this is to imagine that you have taken a bottle of water from the Ohio River down at the foot of Broadway in Paducah. And you look at that bottle of water and it's probably pretty brown. Please don't drink it. If you poured that water through a coffee filter, would the coffee filter get some of that stuff out of the water? It would. It would get the bigger stuff. It would get some of the sediment out of the water. It wouldn't get the chemicals out of the water, but it would get the big stuff. So it's pretty easy to get the initial level of pollution to be reduced. But as we keep reducing pollution, it gets harder and harder and harder. To get that water to be from 80% clean to 90% clean is really expensive. To get it from completely dirty to 10% clean takes a coffee filter. And so that's one of the challenges that the advanced countries had with these laws and the Kyoto Protocol. In fact, United States and China did make a deal specifically on greenhouse gases. And this is a deal that was signed under President Obama. President Trump has indicated that he would like out of this deal. Part of the challenge is that the deal says the United States will reduce its greenhouse gases from the 2005 level by 26% by the year 2025. The deal also allowed China to continue to increase its level of greenhouse gases until the year 2030. And then after 2030, it would begin reducing its level of greenhouse gases. So therein lies one of the challenges. You have different countries producing different levels and types of pollution. And to apply a standard across the board, some of the countries perceive that as inequitable. So other mechanisms that have been created to possibly help with pollution is the creation of what's called an emissions trading system. Essentially, businesses are allowed under these sorts of systems to pollute a certain amount. They're given the right to pollute a certain amount of whatever the pollution is. If they choose to clean it up, they still own the right to pollute that higher amount, but they can sell the rights that they're not actually using. So for example, a company may have been given the right to pollute 10 tons of SO2 into the air, sulfur dioxide. But this is a company that for them to clean it up just a little bit takes a coffee filter. Put a little filter on the end of their smokestack, and all of a sudden they've gone from 10 tons to 5 tons. Well, they have the right to produce 10. A cheap fix, cut their pollution in half. So what they do is they sell the extra 5 tons to the company that really finds it too expensive to get down to their level. And so they will buy up those rights. So essentially, it redistributes the right to pollute to the companies that value it the most. There was a agreement that was made within the United Nations. If you're interested in the environment and follow the news, you've probably heard about the Paris Agreement. This was, again, another agreement that dealt with climate change. The United States has pulled out of this agreement. It will effectively go into action in 2021, but we've begun the process of pulling out. Brazil says that they're still part of this agreement. However, Brazil right now is doing some things that really doesn't follow what the agreement says. So for example, Brazil actually has increased its level of clear cutting, or sometimes it's referred to as slash and burn. Essentially, they're clearing land for cattle production. So they will clear the Amazon rainforest, they'll clear these hillsides of trees, they'll pile them up, and they'll burn the trees. And obviously that creates smoke pollution also. And that's really not part of what this agreement had to do with. The agreement on climate change really relied on the biological functioning of the Amazon rainforest to help clean the air. And Brazil is clearing their forest. Now, Brazil says they have the right to clear their forest because it's their land, but it's having an impact on the world. That's an example of an externality. Indonesia also is doing the same thing. Indonesia produces a large amount of charcoal. In the production of charcoal, essentially you burn a tree very slowly in order to produce the charcoal, but that produces a great deal of smoke. And that smoke is blowing across to other Southeast Asian countries, and they're struggling with the health impacts of all of that air pollution. Indonesia says they have the right to use their own land in that way. And so you can see there's some of the challenges with the environment. Nigeria enacted a law, very specific law, that banned hydrofluorocarbons. Essentially, these HFCs are the most common use of them actually is in those plastic bags that you get at the store. And Nigeria created a law that said we're not going to use plastic bags anymore. So think about the trade-off with that. They're now using paper bags. Paper bags require trees. And now you can see there's an opportunity cost to any of these actions. There's a trade-off. There is no easy fix for any of these actions. So another thing that can be done, and a lot of people don't like to talk about this, but maybe it's to just simply change our behavior. I inquired years ago of some of our students, how many of you, while you were sitting in class, knew that you had an empty house, nobody was at home, and yet you had lights on in your house? And one student even indicated, oh, I have lights on. I left my radio on today. And another student said, oh, I leave my TV on all day long, whether I'm there or not. They have the right to do that, but it's also using electricity. And the production of electricity has an impact upon our environment. No matter how that electricity is produced, it has an impact on the environment. So changing your behavior may simply be, I told the students, why don't you turn your TV off? And they said, well, I'm just one person. What difference does that make? But I pointed out within that class, a third of them had lights on in their home. I said, well, if all of you did it, that would add up. How many lights are on in this country in places that nobody's home? And that might be changing our behavior. We might want to be more conscious of some of our choices and the impact of those choices on the environment. But then to also recognize that choices impact other countries. So for example, when we choose to consume things in the advanced countries, we have to recognize that some of those goods may be manufactured in the emerging countries. And those emerging countries may be experiencing a great deal of air pollution because of that manufacturing. So our behavior really does matter. It's just laws are sometimes not very effective at changing our behavior. Sometimes it just takes a personal commitment. So what you've learned out of this lecture is the principle of an externality. It's a cost or benefit that is borne by a third party to a transaction. We've talked a little bit about environmental enhancement and degradation around the world and how things have been changing, as well as some of the laws that have been enacted to deal with the environment in order to protect the environment. So while I'm currently not actually located in Arches National Park, and I would love to be there, I do encourage you to take a step outside, enjoy some air, and be conscious of how your decisions affect the environment.